Hi, and welcome to the 53rd in our Middle Eastern Islamic history series, charting the journey from Muhammad to the present. We are today discussing the French Levant, the history of Lebanon and Syria during the French colonial period. I'm very excited that I'm going to be joined today by a co-host, Marc Witham, who is going to discuss more of the French perspective as we move through this time period. So some of the rules for those of you who are unfamiliar: this is not an academic presentation. Neither myself nor Marc are accredited in history, philosophy, religion, or any of the topics that we will be discussing today. We are lay individuals who really care about this history and want to make it accessible. To that end, we want to create a secular presentation. To the extent that there are biases, we try to minimize those and try and give you sort of an overhead look at what the history looked like. The next thing is that we're going to be discussing sensitive topics today. So, of course, let's be respectful. That said, I love interactivity. Questions, comments, clarifications, please put those in the chat. I do read the chat, and I will respond in real time as those questions, comments, and clarifications come in. What I like to say is these presentations are a 101 and a 201, meaning that if you don't know anything, I'll try to catch you up. And if you already know something about this period, I'll probably still tell you something you don't know. That's the 201 part. What I also like to do is a 2-hour hard stop. So at 9 p.m. Eastern time, we will stop the presentation. I won't do any more slides. That said, if we have great questions, we'll continue to deal with those questions. But you can know that there will be no new material presented after that 2 hours, and we'll just pick up where we left off in the following week. The next thing is that with the exception of non-political figures, we're talking about philosophers or idealists, the dates that are provided below a person are their years of service, not their birth and death, right? So when we look at Marash and it says that his dates are 1941 to 1944, he didn't die in 44 and he wasn't born in 41, right? That's when he became the leader of Vichy France. This is a recording which you can watch later, like all the other 52 entries in the Middle Eastern History series and all of the other series that we do. They will be uploaded to our YouTube page, which is down there. I'll provide those links again at the end of the presentation. And I would invite you to subscribe to our YouTube channel, get updates about our lectures after they've passed, and you can see them. And additionally, we really appreciate PayPal donations. While we are offering these presentations free of charge, it does cost money to maintain Meetup, to maintain YouTube, and to maintain Zoom. And so we'd really appreciate you helping to contribute to keep this flowing. All right. So during our previous lectures, we've talked about the formulation of Lebanon, and especially as you move into the 17th century, we begin to see a major coalition really developing. Now, Lebanon was under Ottoman rule since 1517, when Selim the Grim conquered the territory from the Mamluks based in Egypt. But the way that the Ottomans decided to rule areas very distant from Istanbul, like Lebanon was to default to local leaders and feudal chiefs, right? This is a typical medieval style of governance. And it turned out that the coalitions that ended up developing in the Mount Lebanon region were primarily dominated by Druze. We're going to talk a little bit about this religion soon, but it's important to know that they don't see themselves and are not seen by others as being Muslims. They're seen as a post-Islamic religion. And because of this, the Druze face discrimination to a certain degree from other Muslim groups like the Sunnis and the Shiites. But these Druze managed to become politically powerful, and the majority of the constituents of Mount Lebanon were themselves actually Maronite Catholic Christians. So that's Catholics, but not Roman Catholics. They follow a different set of rites, R-I-T-E, right? Which means that their prayer is, for example, in liturgical Syriac, as opposed to in Latin. But they see themselves as Catholics in union with Rome. And because of that, you have sort of this Druze Maronite coalition that sort of builds in the beginning of the 17th century, where the Druze are the powerful landowners and a minority population, and the Maronites are the majority population in the mountains. And both of them are looking towards Europe, especially, for example, the Grand Duke of Tuscany, to be their protector against more Muslim control in the lower areas outside of the Lebanon mountains. Now, I have a question of whether the Mamluks that we're talking about were the ones that defeated the Mongols. Yes, the dynasty of Mamluks that was defeated in 1517 were the same ones that defeated Hulagu Khan at the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260. That empire had remained relatively stagnant and consistent across those 300 years. Now, one of the dynamics that we begin to see as we move through the centuries in Lebanon is that because of the proximity of different religious groups between the Sunnis, the Shiites, the Maronites, Orthodox Christians, Melkite Catholics, Druze, all of these groups living in close proximity, what we end up seeing is a number of fractious civil wars. But those civil wars do not align according to ethnic groups. That is to say that you'll find Druze on both sides of these wars. You'll find Sunnis on both sides of these wars. And that the alliances have a lot more to do with interpersonal relationships than they do with the actual religious differences between these two groups. You can see, for example, this was between the Qaisi faction, which was a Druze faction led by the Jumblats, and the Yemeni faction, which was led by a number of Yazbak Druze clans. And so you have different groups, like the clan of Khesrwan, for example, was a Christian group. You have the Shihab dynasty, which at this point was a Sunni group. And so it's much more about how the various different feudal lords in Mount Lebanon, who are controlling very small territories in very close proximity, how they are relating to each other and the balance of power in Lebanon. We also see cases where you have leaders who are able to work with a variety of different groups in this region. Now, Zahir al-Umar is a leader in what is today Israel. He's considered by many Palestinians to be the progenitor of the Palestinian identity or the Palestinian state, although I don't think Zahir al-Umar would have considered that to be a title. He considered himself as a Sunni Arab. That is how he probably would have seen himself. But he was able to consolidate territory under his control, improve the economic output by creating large-scale cotton plantations, creating a large export economy. He also facilitated credit and the development of banking in his territory, and he facilitated the immigration of Christians and Jews from other areas of the Ottoman Empire in order to build the economic facility that he could put out. So you have this sort of sense by a lot of leaders in the coastal areas of the Levant that religious diversity, ethnic diversity, was a natural part of the ongoing ecosystem that would be developed, as opposed to some of the other areas we've looked at, especially, for example, in our last few discussions about Turkey, where there were increasingly solid ethnic delineations between the various groups that were present. Egypt began to modernize at the beginning of the 19th century, and it modernized under the reign of Muhammad Ali. That modernization occurred much more quickly than the modernization within the Ottoman Empire. And in 1831 to 1833, there was an Egyptian war to take over significant portions of the Ottoman Empire. And those significant portions include, as you can see from this map, the Levant territories. This meant that the various feudal clans within the Levant region had to decide whether or not they would side with the Egyptians or whether or not they would side with the Ottomans. And the Shihab clan, which had been the dominant clan since the Battle of Ain Dara, which we saw in 1744, the Shihab clan had actually converted from Islam to Maronite Christianity. So Bashir Shihab II was actually a Maronite king, one of the only Christian princes in the history of the Ottoman Empire. And he chose to stand behind Muhammad Ali when he invaded, and therefore he was able to retain his title and continue to serve as the leader of Mount Lebanon. Yeah, we keep talking about this territory of Mount Lebanon. I just want to clarify what that is. If you look at the map on the right-hand side of this slide, you can see an area that's in the black dotted line. So it's not the entirety of the modern country of Lebanon, but it is a raised portion. And as you can see from the populations, the vast bulk of the population is Maronite Catholic, that red color. But you can also see that there are prominent areas of Druze inhabitation, that's the blue color. despite that, you have other ethnic groups, such as Sunnis in green, or other Christians in yellow, like the Melkites. But that's a very different population than the rest of the surrounding region. What's important to really understand is that there was an increasing relationship that the Maronites had. We talked a little bit about the relationship with Europe, but I think Marc can flesh out even more about that historic connection that the Maronites had to Europe, especially during this period of volatility when Egypt had control for some part of the 1830s and then lost it following 1840. So Marc, please.
All right, thank you, Richard. So basically, I'm going to be talking about the origin of the French-Maronite relationship, and it goes all the way back to the Crusader states. The initial Crusader states, you have the Maronites, like Richard was explaining, they're basically Catholic. A lot of the Crusaders themselves were Franks, first French, who were also Catholic in the same vein, and there was a kind of a natural connection. The next sort of connection was made, I should say, by Louis IX. Here you see a little drawing of that during the Seventh Crusade. Louis IX, who later became Saint Louis or Saint Louis, was on his way to the Holy Land, stopped off in Cyprus, and in Cyprus happened to meet with a group of exiled Maronites and saw them as natural allies. And one of the kind of the themes in the French-Maronite relationship is that there are different components to it. Sometimes it's emphasized, the religion is emphasized, sometimes it's politics, sometimes it's economics, cultural, linguistic, all these things are mixed, but different ones have different priorities over the century. And in this beginning with Louis IX, it was religion and military, because he saw the Maronites, who were still on Mount Lebanon, as natural allies in retaking the Holy Land from the Muslims. And in his in a quote here, nous sommes is I'll translate, but he's in the English, he's using the royal we. And he says, we are convinced that this nation, the Maronites, is part of the French nation, because its friendship for the French is similar to the French that the French have for themselves. And for us, I mean, the royal we, and our successors on the French throne, we promise to give you and all your people, our special protection, just like we give to the French themselves. So this was starting to make it a little bit more concrete. And I also put another quote, because on the other side of the timeline, of President Macron, who visited, and I believe he was, if not one of the first national leaders to visit Beirut after that horrible explosion. And here he's not using the royal we, but he's saying why he was asked why he was there, why was this important, and he said, because it is us, because it is you, because it is us, because our destinies, our future are linked, or I should say tied, unfailingly tied by the links of time, of spirit, of soul, culture, and dreams. You have to get then past through the ninth, a few centuries, then you get in about 1604, you get a concession by the Ottomans that the French could be the protectors of pilgrims going to the Holy Land. 20 years later, under Richelieu, the first minister, he gets the concession that now that the French could send missionaries to Aleppo in Syria, which is quite the concession given the history of the Crusades.
Yeah, I wanted to add that the Maronite community existed in the Middle East before the arrival of the Crusaders. They were an indigenous Christian community.
Okay, so now we skip forward from Richelieu in the 1600s to the Lebanese Civil War of 1860. to give a little context of this, and this will lead to the French intervention later in the year, in May of 1860, what started as a small little incident of several or a small group of Maronite Christians were killed, Druze, and that spiraled out of control. And you had then it spiraled with a lot of violence. You had eventually Catholic missionaries and monasteries, churches being burned by Druze. You had 60 villages were destroyed, 20,000 Maronites were killed. And the news of this reaches Europe, and it doesn't sit well with the European powers. Now I would go to the French intervention, Richard, unless you had some more to add about the Lebanese Civil War itself.
Yeah, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the power struggle that was going on. So this, in many cases, this actually started from a tax dispute. In many cases, the Druze were requesting significant amounts of money from the Maronites who were tilling the land that the Druze owned, right? This is the relationship between the landowners and the sharecroppers. And the Maronites felt that they were unable to pay. The weather had not been favorable for the prior few years. And the Druze exactions were more than the Maronites were willing to put forward. I also want to add that the Druze had the support of the British. And so the Druze were armed with British weapons, which was what made the massacre so one-sided. You have significant amounts of Maronites who fled from Mount Lebanon into what is today Syria. You can see, for example, Abdul Qadir al-Jazairi, who was an Algerian who was in exile because of his wars against the French occupation of Algeria. He went to Damascus, and he, as a pious Muslim, set up a place to receive the Maronite Catholics and give them aid and shelter as they were trying to figure out their new lives as escapees to Syria.
Now to the French intervention. The news of the massacres of these Maronite Christians, these Catholic Maronites, reaches Europe, and it doesn't sit well with the European powers. So they negotiate with the Ottomans to allow a European mixed army of 12,000 to come into Lebanon and secure the peace. And there was an additional one. They also secured autonomy for Mount Lebanon, for the Maronites, a certain level of autonomy. The 12,000 troops that came in, half were French and the other were British, German, Austrian, and the like. This did work rather quickly, and this also accelerated the French-Maronite relationship, because the French basically were coming in to protect the Maronites, and this gave them a better power base. They gave them more security, and it helped protect them in that land themselves. And so that was the start of an acceleration of French influence. And here, the aspect of it was partially religious, more political, and military. And I put in a slide here of the Third Republic. So to give a little context, it's simply to give context to what later on happened with the French Mandate. France had its fair share of colonies, and back in the Bourbon regime, they had Quebec, they had Louisiana, they had Haiti, Martinique, Guadeloupe, Pondicherry in India. They lost Quebec to the British. They sold Louisiana to the Americans. They lost Haiti, which was a big moneymaker for sugar. They lost that to a slave revolt. They lost Pondicherry from the British. And so then the defeat of Napoleon, it took a few decades for the French colonial machine to start to spool up again. And that started around 1830. 1830, the French conquer Algeria, or Algiers, which eventually became the colony of Algeria, later the French territory of Algeria. And this was going on until 1852. 1852, we have a picture or a drawing of Napoleon III. he lost spectacularly to the Prussians. Excuse me. In 1870, he loses power. But between 1852 and 1870, Napoleon III accelerated the French interventions for French colonialism. And you see that in Mexico, you see it in Africa, you see it in Indochina, Polynesia. Sorry. And the other aspect of it, it was in 1870, when Napoleon III loses power, the Third Republic comes in, and it lasts until 1940. One of the aspects of the Third Republic was it was very economically dynamic. France became much richer, economically more powerful, and became a big creditor in the world. And they invested a lot in all over the world, but also in Syria, Lebanon, in infrastructure. You see a picture of the Beirut-Damascus railway. They built bridges, tunnels, things like that. Another aspect of the Third Republic is laïcité, or secularism, which basically is, no religion involving in politics is one way to describe it. So one of the many aspects of the relationship, economic and everything, was religion. Well, when you have a republic that is secular, that religion aspect falls to the wayside. During this period, it became more economic and set the stage for the later mandate, the French mandate starting in 1919. The other aspect in the Third Republic, and you see in the picture of the drawing of the Le Petit Journal, is a concept of la mission civilisatrice. And that means it's basically the white man's burden. It's the idea that it's the responsibility of richer, civilized Europeans to help these uncivilized nations and kingdoms and everything and lift them up into civilization to be nice Christian Europeans, just like everyone else. So that was one of the motivations, and then helped set the stage, like I said, for the 1919 creation of the mandate itself. So
one of the interesting distinctions between the French perception of the French and the Middle Eastern perception of the French is the laïcité that existed in France itself, and was never really felt as strongly in the Middle East. It was felt to a degree. It wasn't felt as strongly because of the Christian nature of the mission civilisatrice. The idea of civilizing people often included a religious component to that. And there were a number of French societies that existed during the Third Republic period. Alliance Israélite Universelle is probably the strongest and most famous one in the Jewish world. Louvre d'Orient is probably the most famous one in the Christian world. Both of these founded in the mid-1800s, and they began building schools and other institutions to protect the minorities with which they were concerned. These institutions did have an effect of secularizing those populations by moving education away from clerical leaders to a standard curriculum. But because they were organized around a religious core of ethnicity, it ended up strengthening the ethnic identification of religion, regardless of the fact that the education itself was more secular in orientation.
Thanks, Richard.
There's a question here. I wonder if the concept of elevating one's global neighbors might have worked better or more peacefully if it hadn't been sold as the white man's burden. I think that that's currently what the United States tries to do. Right? They try to talk about, we're going to democratize the world. We're going to bring about human rights and prosperity. And I think that because of how that has historically been seen, and the idea that it's disrespectful to cultures that don't necessarily agree with those norms, that you're getting a lot of pushback. But if you look at the way it was framed in the early 19th century, people believed that race was determinative, that race actually had a clear and categorical impact in the way somebody thought or acted. Of course, we know that this is not true today, but at that point, they very much saw it as a thing that white men had to achieve. And that if it had been, let's say, an Indian prime minister of the United Kingdom, right? He couldn't achieve that burden. It's simply he would be race inhibited. We have a lot of conversations, for example, between Benjamin Disraeli, and who was Anglican by religion, but Jewish by ethnicity, um, between him and other members of parliament. And he often had to defend his Semitic racial heritage, because in the eyes of many, despite the fact that he was Anglican, and despite the fact that in Britain it was still illegal for a Jew to hold the post of parliamentarian at that point in history, he was seen as incapable of fulfilling the imperial obligations of Great Britain, due to his racial component. All right. One of the things that we've touched on also as regards the development of the Middle East at the end of the 19th century was the Circassian genocide. Now, the Circassian genocide occurred in the 1860s, in what is today Russia, an area about 300 to 400 miles north of the Georgian-Russian border. And the Circassian genocide resulted in the deaths of roughly 700,000 to 800,000 Circassians, but also the emigration of roughly the same number. And those Circassians found places to live throughout the Ottoman Empire. We saw predominantly that they were placed in Anatolia and to a lesser extent the Balkans. But some Circassians were placed in specific locations in the Levant region. In particular, Circassians, because of their militant history and past, they had resisted the Russians for 50 years before the genocide. They were put in places where you had a militant population, usually Bedouins or nomadic Arabs, attacking sedentary populations, or they were put in places to split up a coherent ethnic group, like between different Druze settlements by Sunni Muslims. So the Circassian element, although small in number, begins to transform the way in which Arab leaders in the Levant region process security concerns. Now, as we get towards the end of the 19th century, especially in the 1860s and 1870s, we have a number of changes within the Ottoman administration. These had been started by Sultan Mahmud II in the 1830s, but those were primarily concentrated, as we saw in some of our earlier episodes, on the area close to Istanbul. However, what ends up happening is that by 1864, you have the Tashkili Vilayat Nizamnamesi, which is a piece of legislation that reorganized the entire empire's more extreme regions, extreme as in distant from Istanbul, and replaced many of the traditional leaders with more certified leaders coming out of Istanbul, which created a direct clash between those traditional leaders and the new incoming leaders, who were more oriented towards Istanbul's demands, less concerned with local relationships, and in many cases didn't understand these tight networks that had developed between the various peoples of the Levant, who are much more ethnically diverse in many respects than most areas elsewhere in the Ottoman Empire. One of the particular situations that the Circassians ended up intervening in was what was called the Amia, or the Popular Uprising of 1889 to 1890. This was a situation in which you had local sharecroppers, mostly Christians, working on territory controlled by the Druze in the Hauran region, which you can see there. It's the Syrian region that's close to the border with Israel and Jordan today. And Druze leaders, Sultan al-Atrash wasn't born at that time, but it would have been his parents who would have been alive at that time. And they had to deal with this uprising. And at the same time, you had Syrian Bedouins who were attacking those local peasants to extort money from them. So you end up with this situation where the Circassians and other Sunnis have to be mobilized in order to put down the Bedouins, and the Druze have to have a renegotiation with the sharecroppers, giving the sharecroppers more autonomy and more rights to their own money. Prior to this point, the sharecroppers were only allowed to keep 1/8 of what they produced. There also became a wild shift in Ottoman policy in the beginning of the 20th century. And this was in addition to how centralizing the government had been under the Tishkal Vilayat Nizam Nemesi, the new orientation put forward by the Young Turk revolutionaries who came to power starting in 1908 and really amassing power in the 19 teens was this sense that the Ottoman Empire should be a Turkish empire, that it should be an empire where Turks have a predominant ethnic and social character. Now, this sense also came along with its own, if we can call it that, civilizational mission, Mission Civilisatrice, which, while different in certain respects from the French mission, was not altogether different. You can see the creation of what were called Rushdiya schools throughout the Arab world to teach the Arab people Turkish. And despite the fact that there were more Arabs in the empire in terms of population than ethnic Turks, Arabic was not an official language of the empire. It was not considered that Arabs had the right to rule alongside Turks. And by and large, Arabs were disproportionately unrepresented in the Ottoman parliaments that were convened by the Young Turk revolutionaries. There's a question of what is Palestine's role during this time? At this point, Palestine, as we understand that term today, right, the territory of the former Mandate of Palestine, did not exist as an Ottoman territory. It was divided in the north as several sanjaks of the Beirut Vilayat. In the south, it was several sanjaks of the Damascus Vilayat. And in the center, in Jerusalem, there was what was called the Mutasarrifa, or a particular protectorate on Jerusalem. We have a number of different populations that are existing in Palestine at this region at this time. And by and large, you have minimal Zionist penetration. We're going to definitely talk a lot more about what's going on in Palestine in a few weeks when we get to the Palestinian situation. But basically at this point, from the perspective of Istanbul, Palestine was relatively irrelevant. And from the perspective of what we're going to talk about the French Levant, Palestine was similarly less important. The concept of a Palestinian nation starts to develop in this time, but the term Palestinian isn't directly applied to it until the 1940s, 1950s, in order to distinguish it from other Arab nascent nationalities. That said, I will point out that a lot of the Arab nationalism that we're going to talk about in the Nahda, or the Renaissance, equally applies to what was going on in Palestinian, especially Christian circles, Greek Orthodox Christian circles. So with that intro, this is the Nahda, or the Renaissance. And the Arab Renaissance really starts in the beginning of the 19th century. So we're thinking about this period in the Ottoman Empire, as the Ottoman Empire is getting more controlling in the region and taking a perspective that is less inclined to the development of Arabic culture, of Arab identity, and pushing away from traditional norms in the region, we see an Arab pushback on this. And we've experienced, to a certain degree, what are called the Muslim modernists. And the Muslim modernists that we've seen, for like Namik Kemal in Turkey, Rifai Tahtawi in Egypt, Muhammad Abduh also in Egypt, and Jamaluddin Afghani in Iran. These individuals argued that Islam at its core was a faith devoted to scientific and engineering progress, the light of civilization and development. And because of that, the failure of the Ottoman Empire cannot be from the Ottoman Empire's practice of Islam. It cannot be from the Islamic behaviors of the Ottoman Empire. In fact, they argue that the Ottoman Empire was deeply un-Islamic and violating key traditions and core values of Islam. And so the future of the future of the Islamic world would have to be a modern society based in many ways on European conceptions about freedom of speech, freedom of the press, but understood in an Islamic context, believing that Islam gives all these rights to people. And you will hear people For example, we've had in our group Dr. Sabil, and I would describe his view as Islamic modernism, that he believes that the rights in the US Constitution, for example, are themselves representative of Islamic values and norms. They just haven't been practiced that way. Now, there's a question of why Palestine as a distinct entity didn't develop at this time. It didn't develop at this time because there was no political unification of the region, and the distinctions between the various towns in the Levant region was not significant enough for people to see a meaningful distinction along the borders that we have today. So there was definitely a sense of Levantine Arab identity, and that being distinct from other Arab identities. And that sort of becomes cultivated during this Nahda period. But the idea of a Palestinian as distinct from a Lebanese or from a Syrian or a Jordanian, that is something that develops later. Now, to understand the development of that Levantine identity, we sort of have to pivot a little bit to the other side of the Nahda. So the Islamic modernists or the Muslim modernists had one reaction to this oppressive culture, especially perpetrated by one of the three members of the Young Turk Revolution, Ahmed Jamal, where he hung individuals who were opposed to Ottoman governing behaviors and dissent. The other side of this was the Arab nationalist movement. And the Arab nationalist movement was particularly popular in the Levant region because despite the religious diversity that existed in the Levant region, almost all the population had some command of Arabic. And so that could be a unifying influence. In fact, many of the early proponents of Arab nationalism in the Levant region are Christians, especially Greek Orthodox Christians, as opposed to the Maronite Catholics. Georgi Zaidan was probably the earliest among these Greek Orthodox Christian nationalists, but we also see these individuals occurring in what today we would call Palestine. Konstantin Zoraik, for example, is another similar individual slightly later in time. These Arab nationalists begin to meet at first clandestinely, and then they decide their activities are too illegal under the lack of freedom of speech that existed in the Ottoman Empire. And so they began to meet in Paris, France, where they began to form what was called the Jamiat Arabia al-Fatat, or the Young Men's Arabic Community or Association. And the Jamia would meet throughout 1913. Of course, they no longer needed to meet in Paris after World War I happened, because those territories were no longer part of the non-existent Ottoman Empire, but this became a place for the flourishing of these sorts of ideas. And I want to talk a little bit about the various perspectives that existed within that Arab nationalist movement at a wider scale. You have this idea that I term romantic enlightenment, romantic from the romantic movement of Europe in the early 19th century, and enlightenment in the sense of approaching education, modernization, and development from an enlightened European perspective. Probably the most famous progenitor of this was Maronite Catholic Francis Marash, and you can see him there. In many ways, he blended his Christian heritage and his Christian understanding of reality with this modernist movement. And so in some ways, it can be seen as a Christian reading of Islamic modernism, but played in an Arab context. His most famous literary work was Ghabat al-Haq, in which means the forest of righteousness. Sorry. And he argues in this book that the natural way to create a positive and developmental society is to use love to empower these things, right? And you can see his reappropriation of the words of the Gospel of John. It is by love that the whole world is maintained, by love that all things move, by love each creature perpetuates itself separately, and by love the whole preserves its parts, and so forth. Where love is a representation of first of Christ upon the cross, but also in a sense of an understanding and compassion for an ethnic and local identity that can propel people forward. In many ways, he saw that he wrote a number of contrasts about how the West existed and how the Arab world existed. And he said that the light of modernity is like a lampshade, and that it's slowly bringing light out of the West, but in the Middle East, we're still in darkness. So Marash's key point was that through an understanding of Arab identity, through a return to the cultural bases of Arab civilization, you could create a modern society, a society that would be an intellectual peer of the European states, and should incorporate many of their values. In particular, he liked the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, believing that those same rights were naturally part of an Arab context and should be applied. Now, he disagreed with the European perspective that rights were a natural situation. He believed that they were a civilizational situation, that you had to create them, but he believed that those were the optimal state of society, and that through this understanding of culture and place and time, that those things could be created. You had the view of Arab exceptionalism, and probably the clearest proponent of that was Al-Kawakibi. Al-Kawakibi generally argued in his book al-Qura that what the problem in the Arab world was that most of the people were being led by leaders who did not have the mental capacity to effectively lead. And this came from two distinct sources. The first source is that the Arabs are the people who received the Quran from God, and therefore they were the people who brought the light of Islam into the world. The fact that the Turks were ruling without the Arabs by their side as hegemons over the Arab people, that was a disgrace to the nature of Islam and to the nature of what Arabs had been historically in an Islamic context. So that was the first issue, that Arabs were not equal parts of the Ottoman Empire, that they were subject to oppression, and that necessarily was a problem. He discusses this sort of repression in his book, the nature of slavery and the sources of the nature of misery and the sources of enslavement. So he also describes, however, that a different leadership issue exists in the Arab world. And for those of you who've been following along, you'll notice that this is exactly the same issue that Abd al-Wahhab noticed in the 1700s in Saudi Arabia, which is that there's a large amount of Muslims who are following what is called taqlid, which is the traditions of a learned elder. Now, because these learned elders do not have the capacity to read or write, their understanding of the tradition was simply what was orally passed down to them. And in many cases, it had become stultified, it had become regionalized, and full of what Kawakibi termed to be excesses on one side and failures to develop on the other. And so in this respect, the taqlid was leading to imams literally bringing people to the pit, right? That the problem, and so Abd al-Wahhab said exactly the same thing, that taqlid is a serious problem. The solutions, however, that Kawakibi and Abd al-Wahhab proposed were entirely different. Abd al-Wahhab argued that the entire system for creating laws within the Islamic world was itself flawed, and so a new system would have to be created. Al-Kawakibi disagreed. He said that the system of taking the Quran and the Sunnah, which are the Islamic traditions that surround the Quran, and performing ijtihad upon them, meaning that they would interpret them according to how they apply to today's day and age and assess them in that context, that process was not being used by those who were following the taqlid, those who were following those traditional imams. And so what the Arab world needed was a return to this very vigorous system of debate and examination. And if the Arabs could determine their own religious future in this way, they could effectively become the paragons of the Islamic world and retake their place. In fact, in his book al-Qura, he argued that it should be Mecca, not Istanbul, that is the capital of the Islamic world, because of the centrality of that city in Islamic religious life and the centrality of that city in the story of Arab exceptionalism. And the next view, which is probably the view that is most common as we move forward in time, is the idea of Syrian nationalism. Now, when we use the word Syria here, we're using the Arab word Sham or Bilad al-Sham, meaning the country of the north. That's literally what it means, right? Because relative to the Arabian Peninsula, it's to the north. And Bilad al-Sham includes the areas that we consider today the countries of Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Israel, and Palestine. So these countries all together have a distinct Levantine identity. Probably the first advocate of that is Boutros al-Bustani. He is a Lebanese. He was born Maronite Catholic, but converted to Protestantism because of his interaction with American Protestant missionaries. But his view was that the people of Bilad al-Sham, these Syrians, in that greater sense, were individuals who were very literate, very exceptional, and they had those long-term connections to the West, meaning that they were more educated and more skilled than many other counterparts elsewhere in the Arab world. As a result, there was something unique about the Syrian Arab identity that transcended the more general Arab identity. And in fact, the idea of pan-Arabism, the idea that all Arabs are part of one nation, in an ethnic or racial sense, did not occur during this period. That would be something that would occur in the 20th century. This view is followed up by individuals like Anton Saadeh. And Anton Saadeh is somebody who we're going to see a lot more of as time goes on. But his view was that, for example, Arabic should not be the official language of Bilad al-Sham. Now, this was something where Boutros al-Bustani disagreed. He believed that a return to literary Arabic would solidify the cultural leadership of Bilad al-Sham, but Anton Saadeh disagreed. His argument was that, in actuality, what the language of Bilad al-Sham should be the dialect of Arabic spoken in the Levant, in the north, and accordingly, that should be the one that has prestige, because it is the Syrian identity that needs to be cultivated, not a wider Arab identity, and not looking back to the past necessarily of earlier Arab periods, but to the history of the region. And so to a certain extent, he emphasized the pre-Arab period in Syria, about the variety of Christians and Muslims living together. And this should be of little surprise. Saadeh is another one of these Greek Orthodox Christians, and so his emphasis on the Christian history as being a unifying stratum in the history of the Levant region matches with that history. Another key element that we should talk about in the development of the Levantine identity is what's called the Mahjar, or the Exodus, or the Diaspora, depending on your translation. Now, Mahjar at first was primarily to the United States, but increasingly as immigration restrictions occurred in the United States, it developed in places like Brazil, Argentina, and Mexico. All of these regions, all four of them, still have significant Lebanese and Syrian ethnic populations, majoritarily Christian, but there were some Druze and Sunni minorities mixed in. Probably the most famous of these Christians is Khalil Gibran. Unfortunately, his name is solidified with the A and the H transposed because the United States officials, when he immigrated at the age of 5, had never seen his name before and created that error for all of us to live with. So in Manhattan and Brooklyn, he met with other Syrian immigrants, and by Syrian I mean all of this greater Syrian region, and they created what was called the Pen League, where they would write in a way that they could not write within the Levant because of Ottoman repression. And in many cases, they didn't write necessarily about politics. They wrote about the experience of being a Lebanese person, but they didn't write about it in the sense that we would think today of like, I'm a Lebanese and this is what I see. they would talk about their emotions and their feelings about the world. And because of their unique perspective, they were able to shine a light that is a huge part now of American American poetry. There's a question about what year the data on the map is from. That data is from today. So there are about 8.5 million people of Lebanese descent in Latin America, for example. That's not the size that it was at that time, but it does show pretty accurately the regions to which people went, because those really haven't changed. The numbers are just representative of how big those communities were. Now, I want to share a little bit of poetry from Khalil Gibran, and sort of comment on it. And so he wrote the poem "Dead Are My People" in response to the Great Famine of Mount Lebanon, which we will discuss. But I am not living with my hungry and persecuted people who are walking in the process of death toward martyrdom. I am here beyond the broad seas, living in the shadow of tranquility and in the sunshine of peace. I am afar from the pitiful arena and the distressed, and cannot be proud of aught, not even my own tears. What can an exiled son do for his starving people? And what value unto them is the lamentation of an absent poet? In this way, Khalil Gibran sought to bring attention to the situation in Mount Lebanon, sought to create a sense of urgency in the American population, an American population which really didn't consider the Middle East of terrible importance. At that time, America was very non-interventionist and isolationist in its outlook, and that was reflected in a lot of the perspectives that Americans had. In fact, the United States never even declared war on the Ottoman Empire throughout World War I. Now, there was an interview given towards the end of his life in 1929 where Khalil Gibran was asked whether he could lead the Lebanese, given his sense of foresight, his understanding of emotion, and his command of language and understanding. And his response, I think, says a huge volume about where he saw the enlightenment, or the lack thereof, of his fellow individuals in the homeland. I believe I could be a help to my people. I could even lead them, but they would not be led. In their anxiety and confusion of mind, they look about for some solution to their difficulties. If I went to Lebanon and took a little black book, he was referring to his most famous book called The Prophet, and said, "Come, let us live in this light," their enthusiasm for me would immediately evaporate. I'm not a politician, and I would never be a politician, and I would not be a politician. No, I cannot fulfill their desire. Another interesting thing, I think, since many in this audience are American, is the development of the concept of white in the United States was a direct reflection of the Mahjar. In the United States, under the Naturalization Act of 1790, which was in operation in the early 1900s with several amendments, the only people who could become citizens of the United States were people who were deemed white, people who were deemed black, and people who were deemed indigenous Americans. People from Asia or Latin America, unless they could be proven to be white, were not permitted to become citizens. Now, there is some distinction between those who immigrated and those who were born here. And accordingly, some native-born Asian Americans became citizens. But this was a huge issue for those who had immigrated from the Mahjar, from Syria, including a number of individuals who had lived in the States for over 15 years and believed it was their right to become an American citizen. In particular, we have in the early 20th century, half of the cases that go ruling that Lebanese and other Levantines are not white, and half of them ruling that they are. And it's decisively determined that they are white in the decision in 1915 in the case Dow versus United States, where George Dow, a Maronite Catholic, who came from what is today coastal Syria, declared that he should be white enough to be considered a white person and granted U.S. citizenship. The D.C. Circuit Court agreed, and from that point forward, Middle Easterners have generally been considered white. This decision was codified in 1947, following that in the case Inri Mohriyez, where a Saudi Arabian was confirmed to be white. But this is the reason why, if you ever look at a US Census discussion, North Africa and the Middle East are considered white. It's these court decisions, which to me always sounds hilarious, because if you've seen people from the southern parts of the Middle East, they don't fall under what most people traditionally think of as white, but it's because of this legislative history, a direct result of the Mahjar. All right. And previously we talked about in World War I that there were 5 major Ottoman Empire campaign zones. For us, what really matters are 2 campaign zones, right? The Palestinian campaign and the Arab Revolt campaign. Now, the Palestinian campaign is a campaign that occurred primarily in what is today Israel and Palestine, but it has overflow into Syria and Lebanon. Yeah, and the Arab Revolt was primarily in what is today Saudi Arabia in terms of its territorial extent, but it had huge repercussions in terms of how Arabs saw themselves throughout the Levant region because of the promises that were made in order to secure that revolt. So one of the things that happened, in addition to the actual wartime, was the Great Famine of Mount Lebanon. Now, it's important to discuss how exactly this occurred. So you had a Franco-British blockade of the Mediterranean, and the Ottoman Empire had always, in the late 19th and early 20th century, had a failure for a navy. It was improved somewhat through their alliance to Germany in World War I, but generally speaking, the Entente powers were able to maintain an impressive blockade on the Levant region. And that blockade was directly injurious to the silk industries that had been implemented both by Zahir al-Omar in Palestine and by Bashir Shihab II in Lebanon. Because of this, and the economy had was basically not suited for growing food, combined with a massive locust plague that affected almost all the Levant in 1916, food was very hard to come by. And Ahmed Jamal made the executive decision that he would cut off all food heading towards the mountain. And by the mountain, I mean the entire core of Lebanon. He would prevent food from going towards the mountain and instead give it to the Ottoman soldiers who were defending the region. And in so doing, he consigned 200,000 Maronites to death. And those 200,000 who survived, so it's a 50% casualty rate, and those 200,000 who survived, significant portions were malnourished, underdeveloped, and this among most Lebanese today is considered a genocide against the Maronite population, given how intentional Ahmed Jamal Pasha's misdirection and redirection of food was in order to feed his own soldiers at the expense of the indigenous population. So on the Arab Revolt side, the British were courting the Sharif of Mecca, who was Hussein bin Ali Hishami. And Hussein bin Ali needed some incentive in order to begin his revolt, given the fact that he already had a pretty decent relationship with the Ottomans. His relationship was incredibly autonomous, which, considering all of the centralization reforms that we talked about, was very surprising. And so he needed a lot more to be convinced to join the British situation. There's a point here that the Druze also suffered from the famine. Yes, Mark?
When the Great Famine, the autonomous region in Mount Lebanon that had started in 1861 ended in 1915 because of this war.
Yeah. When the French intervened, they managed to secure a specific autonomous set of controls.
Mm-hmm.
So in order to incentivize Hussein ibn Ali to join and to foster the Arab Revolt, Vincent Arthur Henry McMahon from the British Foreign Service was entitled to give him correspondence encouraging him that he would be responsible for the governance of an Arab state in much of the Middle East. This map on the left-hand side is a map that is indicative of at least nominally what the claims that the British had made were. In particular, as concerns the Levant, we have a discussion that the districts of Mersina and Alexandretta and portions of Syria lying to the west of the districts of Damascus, Hama, Homs, and Aleppo cannot be said to be purely Arab and should be excluded from the proposed limits and boundaries. Now, that area is indicated on the map on the right-hand side in gray, because those cities are delimited on that line, and that area would roughly correspond to the most religiously diverse part of the Levant region. There is argument today among those who tend to be more in the Zionist camp, arguing that those areas are also to the east of the mandate for Palestine when that would be reconstituted by the British, constituted by the British. And so there's a debate about whether the Hussein McMahon correspondence includes the territory of Palestine. Most historiographers who have examined the Hussein McMahon correspondence argue, however, that the British government was not considering any type of Jewish self-determination or Jewish homeland when this was being discussed. And if it had been, there would have been a discussion perhaps of Jerusalem or of the other areas within Palestine that have specific religious significance, especially to British Christians. But none of that occurred. And the understanding that Hussein had was roughly analogous with what Vincent McMahon intended. Whether or not the British were actually going to follow up on those correspondences, or whether those were simply to lure Hussein ibn Ali into the fight, are a much bigger debate in historical circles. Regardless, Hussein ibn Ali bet, and you had the Arab Revolt occurring. The revolt was very small and measured. It was primarily contained to Saudi Arabia. It was a weird situation where the Ottomans couldn't allocate enough troops to put it down, but the Arabs didn't have enough forces to remove the Ottomans from their barracks, their entrenched positions. So basically Mecca fell and Yanbu fell to the rebels, but Medina was under continued Ottoman garrisons. Nevertheless, by the end of the war, there had been established a relationship, primarily facilitated by T.E. Lawrence, you can see in the picture on the left-hand side, with the family of Hussein ibn Ali. There's a question, the Arab Revolt took place during World War I? Yes, it did. It took place in 1916 until 1918, and it was part of World War I. Now, of course, we all know that the British and the French also had a very different idea about how the Middle East was going to be split up. And this was codified in 1916 with the Sykes-Picot Agreement that was signed in the presence of Russian ambassador Sergei Sazonov in St. Petersburg. And this agreement would put the Levant region profoundly in French territory, and it included a clarity that the British thought that Palestine would have a special religious significance to them and should fall in their zone of influence. This was further created by facts on the ground. In 1918, Edmund Allenby took over the control of the Egyptian Expeditionary Force, which despite its name included no Egyptians and no expeditions. But the force was primarily made of New Zealanders and Indians, and to a lesser extent, but still present, British individuals from Europe. Now, there's a question of whether Sykes and Picot were generals. Neither were. They were both from the foreign services of their respective countries. Now, Edmund Allenby was an individual who had learned from a number of the failures in the Middle Eastern campaigns before him, and was able to win several successive battles through what is today Israel and Palestine, taking Amman in Jordan in March of 1918 and continuing an upward march. He fought a climatic battle at Megiddo, which should have ended the world, but apparently religious scripture is wrong, and he continued upward, arriving in the city of Damascus by the war's end in the Middle Eastern theater, which was an armistice in late October of 1930. Now, as you can see on the right-hand side of the map, on the eastern side of the map, coming in from the desert were the members of the Arab Revolt, led by Hussein ibn Ali, who facilitated and assisted Edmund Allenby in making several of his conquests. But because of this, British control in what is today Israel and Palestine was secure, as well as in southern parts of Syria, despite the fact that the French were claiming the territories of the Levant. There's also two other things that's worth pointing out in addition to Syria and Lebanon, is that you can see that there's a significant territory in what's today Turkey that the French were claiming. That's the territory of Cilicia. And they were also claiming the northern part of Iraq, which they swapped to the British for some other favorable terms, including access, financially speaking, to Mosul's oil, which was the reason the British wanted the region in the first place. So, as a result of Versailles, what was developed was the mandate system. But the mandate system would not be implemented until 1920. So you had this sort of weird interwar period where you had occupation zones throughout 1919 controlled by the British and the French, and these were divided into Occupation Zone North, Occupation Zone West, Occupation Zone South, and Occupation Zone East, colored on this map for a little bit easier in terms of reading. Now, these zones would be transitioned to the mandate system, but the transition was rather shaky and difficult. And the mandate system was originally designed with the purpose that these would create self-governing institutions that would eventually allow these countries to become independent. In functional policy, only the Americans wanted that perspective. The British and the French wanted to administer them as colonies, and with American isolationism from the international sphere, by and large, the British ran them as colonies. Now, we talked also about the Turkish War of Independence, and the Turkish War of Independence was a war against numerous parties, but you can also see in the south that fight against the French in Cilicia. And that fight took various stages. So in 1918, you can see Edouard Bremont, who is the French general, leading a French expeditionary force into the region and repatriating a number of Armenians. These were Armenians that had been expelled during the genocide. And as a result, the Armenians fought dutifully by the French as they invaded the territory. And this, of course, created numerous clashes between the Turks who had come to possess those homes and the Armenians who claimed them as their historical right. There were also a number of Armenians living in what is today northern Syria who had fled during the genocide. And so there was a lot of upheaval as large numbers of Armenians and other populations that were non-Turks started to move into northern Syria. And as we pointed out, especially in Mount Lebanon, the ethnic demographics are very important because of the relationships between those groups. And so this began to cause a great deal of instability in the region. Combine that with the Turkish mission, or the Misak-i Milli, the National Pact, where Ataturk claimed that significant amounts of territory that are now part of Syria actually belonged in truth to Turkey, and he would fight for those territories absent any treaty. This resulted in fights against the French occupation in Cilicia. And those fights eventually led to a French retreat from the cities of Marash and Urfa and a number of other cities in Cilicia. And the Armenians retreated with the French soldiers, knowing that there would likely be a massacre if they stayed behind. The French also maintained a successful siege at Ain Tab. But afterwards, the French realized that it would probably be easier to work with the Turkish government than not. And in March of 1921, they signed a peace treaty that would be further clarified in terms of its territorial distinctiveness with the Treaty of Ankara in October of 1921. And this treaty meant that the French were no longer going to engage the Turks, but the Turks had given up their claims on the areas of northern Syria, such as Aleppo, that they had previously maintained. The one exception being the territory of Alexandretta, which we'll talk about soon. So while you had this OETA system, with those occupation zones. The Americans sent what was called the King Crane Commission to assess the populations in terms of their size and their religious distinctiveness, as well as the aspirations of the people in those regions. And the view that they came to was that all of the regions, OETA East, which by far had the largest population, owing to having the two cities of Damascus and Aleppo, which were both gigantic cities. Amman is now larger than both of them today, but at that time, Amman was a smaller town. OETA West had a sizable population that was roughly half Muslim and Christian. There were some more Muslims, but it was roughly evenly split. And OETA South, which is primarily Israel and Palestine, had a strong Muslim majority as well, but a much smaller population. Regardless, despite in the 36 towns the King Crane Commission, the King Crane Commission visited, it was determined that almost all of them wanted a strong, unified Syrian state that would be independent, or barring that, a mandate under U.S. control, because they considered the U.S. to be less imperialistic than Britain or France. These ideas, of course, were derailed by the San Remo Conference of the 25th of April, 1920, which divided the region into the mandates that we're familiar with today. In Syria, there was an election to create a legislature prior to the French directly coming in. So remember that it was British troops under General Allenby that have been occupying Damascus and areas of what is today South Syria, and the French hadn't yet made landfall. And they wouldn't until the middle of 1919, starting in Lebanon and then moving into Syria. So this was a time when Damascus was still under British control. And accordingly, the Syrian National Congress had people voting on it, and there was a variety of opinions that were discussed. Most Syrians existed on a spectrum between desiring to be a French colony, which was something that was quite strong in the Mount Lebanon region, to full independence, which was the predominant view of most Muslims in the area. And there was some degree to which there was negotiating room. So Faisal, who was the eldest son, Faisal, who was the eldest son of Hussein bin Ali, right, the leader of the Arab Revolt, was granted the title of king by the Syrian National Congress. They voted to approve his kingship, and Faisal I began to negotiate with the French, who were beginning to move in based on their claim to a mandate. Remember, he was coronated in March of 1920. The San Remo Conference was a little over a month later. And so Faisal and Clemenceau, before he had been coronated as king, we're talking about the relationship that France would have, Clemenceau being the prime minister of France, the relationship that France would have with the state. And the French made extremely harsh demands, requiring all kinds of sovereignty, the ability to move French troops in the area, the ability to control the external relations of the Syrian kingdom, and a variety of other concessions. Surprisingly for Clemenceau, Faisal actually acceded to those, arguing that if he didn't, the French would simply overpower the Syrian kingdom, and therefore any independence that could be granted was better than none. Many in the Syrian National Congress disagreed, and so there was quite a bit of antagonism towards Faisal I over his decision to capitulate to French demands. It's worth in this period talking a little bit about the Faisal-Weizmann Agreement, which was in 1919, so about a year earlier than this, before Faisal had really come to Syria and solidified his hold. And the Faisal-Weizmann Agreement was one where Faisal saw that the Jewish Zionist collective that had begun to develop in the region of Palestine, that collective could be useful for helping keep the British in Damascus and keeping the French out. And the British seemed to be more amenable to Arab autonomy than the French were. However, not soon after the Faisal-Weizmann Agreement had been signed, the power that the French would have in the region became clearer and clearer, and the antagonism that most in the Syrian National Congress had to what they saw as a colonial act of Jewish colonization of the Middle East meant that the Faisal-Weizmann Agreement was a dead letter. There's a question of, were there specific resources in Syria that attracted the French? I'm trying to ultimately understand why the French had an interest in the Arab world beside the axiomatic need for oil. It's actually worth pointing out that Syria didn't have known oil reserves at the time that the French were interested. So oil is actually not the main interest. Mark, is there something, would you like to comment on this?
Yeah, I was going to cover that on my slide on the mandate.
Okay, perfect. Okay. So the French started disembarking in large numbers at Beirut on the 18th of November 1919, and they were marched forward into the Syrian mountains by Henri Gault, and he had a combination of soldiers at his command. At the predominant group of soldiers that he had were French individuals from France proper. That said, he had significant contributions from local populations. These were populations of minorities that the French felt that would be effective in fighting. And we're going to see these are the troupes spéciales. These are the troops that we're going to see during the colonial period. And these are primarily made of Circassians, Alawites, and Maronites. Now, Gault started moving his forces further east towards Damascus in order to challenge the government of Faisal, primarily because he felt that not enough concessions have been made to increased French desire for control, despite the fact that Faisal was doing everything in his power to assure that the French control would be unimpeded. The fact that these French troops were mobilized and marching led to a Syrian desire to repel the attack. So Yusuf al-Azma, who you can see in the lower right-hand side of that picture, who was the war minister under Faisal the First government, decided to rally Syrians together against the French invaders. And they put together a ragtag force based primarily on individuals who had received some Ottoman training with mismatched Ottoman weapons and artillery. And the war was over in 4 hours. This is the Battle of Maysalun. And the Battle of Maysalun is still celebrated today by many Syrians as a symbol, and by Arabs in general, as a symbol of the rejection of colonialism and fighting against all odds. The loss at Maysalun sealed the end of Faisal the First government, and he fled into exile. He would eventually become he fled into exile at the British invitation to Iraq, where he became the king of Iraq. He also fled with a very famous Arab nationalist, Sati al-Khusri, who was responsible for the educational ministry in Syria and became responsible for developing Arab nationalist curriculum in Iraq. The Battle of Maysalun is also famous for another major contribution, and you can see this is Nazik al-Abid. She was a very famous nurse, and she led some of the Red Star. This was the forerunner of the Red Crescent, which is a parallel organization of the Red Cross that exists in the Muslim world. And Nazik al-Abid brought these Red Star nurses to tend to the wounded within the Syrian war. She survived the war, and she's considered a heroine who fought for Syrian causes. She rejected the right of the French to rule. Despite that, she continued to live under French occupation until she was expelled to Lebanon, where she lived in exile. So when the French were victorious at the Battle of Maysalun, they came to the conclusion that a unified Syria would be directly deleterious to their interests in maintaining control over the territory. And so they did what had not been done in Syria, which was to divide the population ethnically. As we pointed out, in our discussion of Lebanon in the Ottoman period, relationships were developed tribe by tribe, clan by clan, not along religious or ethnic relationships in the Syrian context. And the French were intentionally trying to provoke this development in order to make rule more effective. In fact, the nominal states, for example, the Alawite state and the Druze state, which we're going to talk about more in depth, which supposedly should be controlled by those ethno-religious minorities, still had a significant amount of French control, French vote rigging in the various elections that would result in pro-French leaders coming to the fore in all of these states, and the creation of distinct governments where the people did not want to be distinct. There's a question of, was this to cause ethnic infighting over borders? Part of it was that. Part of it was the idea of creating distinct nationalities, and with more groups with less population, it would be less easy to create a coherent Syrian national identity. It's also worth pointing out that there were certain cases that, quote, don't fit the narrative quite so well. The first one is that the state of Damascus and the state of Aleppo stayed independent from 1920 until 1922. And the French goal was to foster a competition between the powerful cities of Aleppo and Damascus. Damascus had always been the largest city, still is today. But because of that, Aleppo would be subordinated to it under a unified government. If Aleppo and Damascus were separated into two distinct states, well then, it could serve to create a rivalry between those two different regions. That ended up not being the case. And in fact, by 1922, the state of Damascus and the state of Aleppo had actually been merged by the French government as the state of Syria, because it actually turned out that the people of the north and the people of the south wanted a union. They were interested in a union, and they kept pushing in terms of all their elections, despite all the vote rigging, to create that union. And the French figured it would be easier to rule both of them with a more pliant leader in charge of the whole region than their original philosophy of splitting them along ethnic lines. The flip side of this is that we have two regions of Syria that in theory should have been ethnic enclaves based on this style of division. The first one is the Golan region, which borders what is today Israel and Jordan, in the southern part of Syria. And the Golan region should have been given to the Circassian minority, because the Circassians had been loyally fighting beside the French and would continue to do so throughout much of the period. The Circassians also had a bloody history of fighting against the Bedouin, and so were natural allies to the French, considering that they felt that whatever government was in power, they needed to stand by that in order to not be expelled again. Remember, they had been expelled from their ancestral homeland in what is today southern Russia. But they were not granted a state, and it's not clear from French discussions why that was the case. Perhaps it was because they asked too late. By 1936, when questions like this had really been facilitated, we're going to see that the French are already negotiating a way out of Syria to a large extent. The other category is in the Upper East, the northeast area of Syria, which is called the Jazeera region. This is a region which had historically been majority Arab, but because of Turkish persecution of Assyrians and other Christians in the empire, as well as increasing persecution of Kurds throughout the 1920s, you had large Kurdish and Assyrian populations moving into the northern part of the Jazeera region. And these Assyrians and Kurds wanted to create their own autonomous region to solidify their power against the Arab majority. The French seemed to oppose this. And again, it's not entirely clear why, but it could perhaps be the case that they were afraid of further rebellions from their Arab population. And considering the Great Syrian Revolt, which we're going to talk about, that was a constant fear. Mark, would you like to add something?
Actually, I wanted to highlight the in the northeast of the state of Aleppo is the Kurdish area. And I was wondering if there a particular reason. I was wondering if there's a particular reason why that is delineated.
No, that's what I'm talking about. That's the Jazeera.
Okay. Apologies.
Yep. All right. And as we move into Greater Lebanon, we see that the French negotiated a specific situation with the Maronite population there. It was the French intention that Mount Lebanon be the Lebanese state, and that the surrounding territories, which had historically been ruled by the governors in Damascus, would remain in the control of Damascus. And as you can see from the map, those are territories without large Christian populations. The south of Lebanon is majority Shiite, the east of Lebanon is majority Sunni and Shiite, and the north is majority Sunni. But the Lebanese had been, and the Lebanese, and by that I mean the people of Mount Lebanon, had become desperately afraid of going through the famine conditions again. And these areas that were just outside of the mountain were very fertile, especially the area to the east of Mount Lebanon, the Bekaa Valley. Now, accordingly, the Maronites had charted it exactly in such a way that they would be a bare majority over this new Greater Lebanon, and therefore would be able to solidify their control over the region. That said, this introduced an entirely new ethnic element, ethno-religious element, which had not really been present in the Mount Lebanon society, where over 80% of people were Christian. Now it was much closer to a 50-50 split. In order to create a unifying ideology for these people, in order to prevent a large-scale Muslim uprising, which was the reason why Greater Lebanon would be carved away from Syria in the first place, in the Maronite idea and the Maronite principle, they created a new sort of nationalism called Phoenicianism, where the Lebanese dug back to their Phoenician past and argued that this was the new Phoenicia, that they were redeveloping that historical entity. Probably the most prominent advocate of this ideology is Said Aql, who argued that the Lebanese people are the Phoenicians, unmolested and undisturbed, and should remain a Phoenician society in the future. And that still means, of course, that they'll speak Arabic. It still means that they'll continue with most of the modern traditions, but it means that they are a distinct population that should not be reincorporated into a larger Syria, that they should have their own home rule. Many historians have argued that the view of Phoenicianism is counter-historical. We know that there are large admixtures in the Christian population of Mount Lebanon from the Crusader states. The county of Tripoli was based in Mount Lebanon. We also know that there's admixture among the Muslim populations from the Arabs who invaded from the south. And of course, there are movements of populations, and some of the designations that, for example, that the Phoenicians are distinct from the Canaanite civilization, despite the fact that their language is along the same spectrum as Canaanite, those seem to also be under attack by anti-Phoenicianists. Despite this, Phoenicianism has not just adherence within the Maronite Catholic world, but it has informed a significant degree of Muslim identity in Lebanon after the National Pact, which we're going to talk about hopefully soon. And Mark, you want to add some things about how the mandate was administered?
Yeah, and to address the previous question when it came to Syria, Lebanon versus Iraq, Iraq was cobbled together by the British of, if I remember correctly, 3 Ottoman provinces. Several years before World War I, well, you have to know, first of all, France is more of a land power, Britain is more of a sea power, and several years before World War I, the Royal Navy had switched their fuel from coal to oil, and which was very significant because in Britain, there's plenty of coal, but there's no oil. However, in northern Iraq, around Mosul, there's a lot of oil. So that's what, people like Churchill were quite interested in obtaining. To secure their oil meant securing their navy, meant securing their rule. Britannia rules the sea, sort of thing. France had no interest in and no connection with these provinces that became Iraq, but they did have connections with Syria, Lebanon, particularly with Lebanon. Particularly this interest with or this relationship with the Maronites that had gone back centuries, and they had a lot of economic relationships that had gone the decades before during the rule of the Third Republic. So the way the French saw it, they saw that, again, not unlike Louis IX, Clemenceau saw the Maronites as a kind of a base, not a base of operation, but kind of a base upon which French power could be distributed in Greater Lebanon and in Syria, because Greater Lebanon was, in terms of the French were concerned, it was a way of securing their ally, the Maronites, with more territory, because the land in and of itself was not very large. It would not have, Mount Lebanon could not have made a country, or at least it would have been very hard. And like Richard was saying, it was agriculturally poor. So they wanted to give the Maronites a greater economic base and political base to basically make to facilitate the French power in Lebanon.
If I could also add, you also have to look at it from the perspective of the Anglo-French rivalry that had existed, and despite the fact that they were allies in World War I, that rivalry hasn't quite disappeared even today. And so if the French didn't claim those territories in Syria, the British would have taken them, right? And so there's this sort of juxtaposing of, we want it for our prestige, and so that they're denied the prestige as well, in addition to all of the arguments that Marc just made.
Yeah, and just to add to that was the British and the French did not have a unified military command in World War I until roughly about the last year of the war, I think in 1918. But as soon as the war finished on November 11th, 1918, they started to split, and their individual interests got them to diverge. And one of the things about France in 1919 is France had a very significant casualty vis-a-vis the ratio vis-a-vis the population, and an entire strip of France from Switzerland to the North Sea had been absolutely devastated. The government post-World War I had to show the people, oh yeah, we at least we got this. And here's the prestige. We got this colony. There are these economic interests. And also, like Richard had said, the rivalry, the colonial rivalry that had almost made them come to blows in the years before World War I was starting to manifest itself again. So, thanks.
Do you want to talk about this slide?
That was my talking about that slide.
Okay. So you can see that the completely different reception that Gouraud gets in Lebanon versus what the reception he gets in Syria, right? In Syria, he has to fight the Battle of Maysalun. His occupation is direct and antithetical to the government. When he arrives in Mount Lebanon and he proclaims the state of Greater Lebanon, he is welcomed by the Maronites. And so you can see even the colonial flag. In most of the colonial flags, if we go back a slide, you'll notice that the French insignia is in the upper left-hand corner of the flag, right? And the rest of the flag is a different motif. By contrast, the Lebanese flag is literally the French flag with the cedar on it, right? That cedar, the historic cedar that represents Lebanon's forests. But that should show you how welcomed the French were by the Maronites, who were empowered by them. And Marc, you want to address this slide?
Yeah, so basically with independence that happened in 1943, the relationship between the Maronites and France had changed. What had started out as a religious military sort of relationship under Louis IX that had then become more economically tied during the Mandate and during the Third Republic, really drew back towards what is the cultural and the linguistic. There are 36,000 Lebanese born in France. There are about 25,000 or 22,000 French in Lebanon, which is far more than any other country in the region. And so in terms of the linguistic side, you see, road signs, you see license plates. There are greater relative amount of French high schools, French schools in Lebanon than any other country in the region. A lot of the press, whether it's written or it's television, is also in French, and it's at least 40% of the population in Lebanon speaks French at some time, at least to a good level, and 20% speak French on a daily basis. And one of those things is, again, that level of what they would call francophonie, is French speaking, is also concentrated more in the Maronites. There are far more Maronites that will speak French as opposed to the Druze or any other minority in Lebanon.
Absolutely. And French has also had a disproportionate effect on the Lebanese dialect of Arabic. So if we look at the other ones of the six, I want to draw your attention to the state of the Alawites. Now, the state of the Alawites, you can see, is rather ethnically diverse. That light green color, well, the borders don't sort of show you where the state of the Alawites are, but if you follow that sort of if you follow the borders of Lebanon in the south, and you see the territory of what is today Turkey in the north, that area between them sort of stretched along the Syrian coast, that is the state of the Alawites, more or less. And if you look there, you can see actually quite closely that the majority of that territory has an Alawite majority. But that is quite deceptive in terms of how many people that actually represents. Most of the major cities of the region were not Alawite majority. For example, Latakia, which was the capital city along the seaside, had a Sunni Muslim majority. And in fact, this was a situation very similar to what had occurred in Mount Lebanon, where the Druze owned the land and the Maronites were the sharecroppers. In this situation, the Sunni Muslims were the owners and the Alawites were the sharecroppers. And so the French administration, by buttressing the Alawite minority, by buttressing the Alawite majority, the disenfranchised Alawite majority, it had the effect of promoting an Alawite sense of separateness from the Syrian people, and there was generally less antagonism than in the other regions of Syria, excluding Lebanon. Of course, Lebanon, there was genuine appreciation. Here, there was acceptance. And it's important for us to point out what we're talking about when we say that these people are Alawite. So if we remember back to our discussions of Twelver Shiite Islam, right, after Muhammad died, according to the Shiites, the power was vested in the successors of Muhammad's house, particularly through his son-in-law Ali, who became what was called the first Imam, or the first infallible successor of the Prophet. Those who are what are called 12 or Shiites believe that there are 12 such successors, the 12th of which has gone into hiding and will return at the end of days. But the 10th and 11th of these successors had a student of theirs who himself began to formulate new ideas about the understanding of Ali, that Ali had existed at several points in history and had a number of more divine attributes than are typically accorded to a human being. This belief began to be developed. Now, we don't know the extent necessarily of Alawite beliefs, and we have certain books that we believe are Alawite holy books, but they have not been confirmed by internal Alawite sources. In many cases, Alawites continue to keep their religion relatively secretive, but we know several elements of it. For example, we know that they celebrate a number of Christian and Gnostic holidays. For example, they do drink wine, and they use wine in a number of Halloween celebrations. They celebrate Christmas and Easter, along with a number of other Muslim holidays, like Eid al-Fitr and Eid al-Adha. They also have certain Gnostic elements in their philosophy, things like reincarnation that shows up in their context, and the idea that there is a significant amount of real experience that isn't known through surface level interaction, which is what's called the batiniya, that real things have much deeper meaning. Because and one of the things that really distinguishes them in many respects from the Shiite Muslims that are similar in other aspects is that they don't have a central area of worship, at least not at this point in history. During the reign of Hafiz al-Assad, there is what is called Sunnification of Alawism, where the Alawites begin to have prayer mosques very similar to Sunni mosques. But during this early period, by and large, Alawites do not pray in a specific religious consecrated space. There's a question of, are the Alawites considered an Abrahamic religion? I don't see why they shouldn't be. They definitely have origins in a syncretism between Islam and Christianity, both of which are Abrahamic religions. So I don't see why. I typically consider it a post-Islamic religion in that Islam existed first, right? And then this developed out of it using other ideological substrates. Because of this relationship that the Alawites had towards the French occupation and control, they were highly influential in the Troupes Spéciales du Levant that we talked about earlier, these indigenous forces that fought on the French side in terms of maintaining order throughout the colony. Now, in 1936, against the wishes of the Alawites, the territory would be reintegrated into Syria following the government in France taking a fundamental change in policy towards Syria and respecting the views of the Syrians in Damascus and Aleppo to a greater degree than they had been. Now, before we go to Jabal al-Druze, or the Druze region, it's worth recapitulating what the Druze are. So the Druze are believers they were originally in the Ismaili Shiite camp, and the Ismaili Shiites believed that the caliphs of the Fatimid Empire were themselves part of this imam sequence. So they diverged from the Twelvers in who they selected as their imams. And so the sixth Fatimid Caliph Al-Hakim, disappeared at a certain point, and the Druze believe he received revelation. This revelation resulted eventually in the culmination of their religion. And there are several different points to make here. The first one is that similar to the Alawites, they believe in this concept of batiniya. And in the case of the Druze, the batiniya is so important and so sacred that the majority of their population are not permitted to know it, because they fear that the knowledge of this batiniya would result in people pursuing incorrect ideas without the proper context the documents that contain this batiniya, without the proper context to evaluate them knowingly. And so society is divided between two populations, the juhal, or the ignorant, and the uqal, those who are learned scholars. And the uqal must be over 40 years old. They can be either a man or a woman. And they are allowed to learn the secrets of the tradition. And the juhal are supposed to respect the views of the uqal because the uqal are the possessors of the batiniya. Druze do have their own prayer. They pray at a place called a maqam, which literally means place, or a khilwa. And they pray on Thursdays as opposed to Fridays. Only the uqal are required to pray. The juhal are not required. And at these prayers, they will recite parts of their holy book called the Rasail al-Hikmah, or the Epistles of Wisdom. We only have portions of this book because, of course, those portions were only revealed by uqal who either converted or defected, and the likelihood that if you are uqal, if you're this connected to the tradition that you would defect is very small. Now, From a political perspective, the Druze, as we pointed out in Lebanon, tended to be the landowners that sort of dissipated to a certain degree as we moved through the 19th century. But in that southern region of Syria, where Jabal al-Duruz, or the Druze mountain, that region was significantly more Druze than any other. And we should point out that the Alawite state was about 60 to 70% Alawite. The Druze state was over 85% Druze. And so there was an absolute Druze majority in this region. The Druze were inclined, actually, to be receptive to the French, but the French were notoriously unfamiliar with Druze customs and a respect for the Druze militant history. In particular, Captain Carbier, who you can see there posing with a number of Druze who seem absolutely excited to be in the same photograph with him, was one of these individuals who believed that he could modernize the Druze economy. Now, this individual ruled more autocratically than the Druze would have liked. And in fact, when he was on his leave, almost all of the Druze went to Damascus to petition the French government to replace him with somebody else, somebody who was more amenable. But what exactly was he doing that was such a problem? The first part is that they didn't respect Druze customs of home. For example, this is Adham Khanjar, and Adham was a person who had attempted to assassinate Gouraud, Gouraud being that lead French general who solidified French control over the Levant region. And Adham Khanjar had sought refuge in the home of Sultan al-Atrash, who was a leading sheikh among the Druze. Among the Druze, there is a belief that those who seek protection should be afforded it, no matter what their crimes have been. But the French did not accept that as reasonable, and so they violated the sanctity of his home and kidnapped Adham Khanjar. He was later executed. But Sultan al-Atrash was so angered by this violation of the sanctity of his home that he actually pursued a convoy of French soldiers who he believed were holding Adham. They weren't. He killed several French soldiers trying to look for the person stolen from his home. Under Carbier specifically, there began to be very steep punishments. We have discussions, for example, that a cat went missing from the French compound, and so several Druze were held in prison for a long period of time as a result of this, what was seen as a minor infraction, if they could even pin the cat's flight on the Druze activities. Another thing that he did is he tried to teach the populations, sorry, let me rephrase. The Druze economy that had existed in Jabal al-Duruz was a feudalistic economy where, similar to what had existed in Lebanon, where you had Druze landlords and Maronite sharecroppers, in the Jabal al-Duruz region, you had Druze owners and Druze sharecroppers. They just happened to be from different tribal factions. From the position of the French, this seemed like a feudal system that needed to be modernized and organized. And Carbier basically tried to perform a top-down communist revolution. That didn't work. The people were very comfortable with the traditional ways in which they had been living. And so he decided that if they weren't going to willingly choose to abandon their feudal system, he was going to compel them to do so. And so he forced them to perform a number of building projects. The one problem, of course, is that he had no way of paying them. He didn't have enough revenue in order to do so. And so he effectively turned them into his own feudal slaves, which you can imagine was deeply resented by the population. And so Jabal al-Duruz was a place where people were already in a negative atmosphere when the tinderbox really broke. And what that particular event was is that Karabiye had invited a number of Druze, Sarai, who we're going to talk about, was a lead general, was the high commissioner at the time. He asked a number of Druze leaders to meet him. Sultan al-Atrash rejected the invitation, rather wisely in hindsight. The Druze leaders who had come to speak to the French were jailed, and this led to an uprising in Jabal al-Duruz by Sultan al-Atrash. One of the ironies is that when Sultan al-Atrash led this uprising, he didn't lead it with the intent of creating an uprising across Syria. He was specifically responding to the grievances in Jabal al-Duruz. That said, his revolt has been seen as the catalyst for a whole Syrian revolt. And in many ways, Syrians continue to honor this. In this case, for example, they put a Syrian flag on the statue of Sultan al-Atrash. This is in Majd al-Shams, which is historically Syrian territory under Israeli control in the Golan Heights. So you can imagine this is actually hanging in Israel, this Syrian flag, to celebrate the revolt. But just because Sultan al-Atrash had localized grievances does not mean that there weren't larger grievances in Syria overall. And those generally fall into three categories. The first was that many Syrians had been educated. Some of them had been part of the Mahjar and came back, right? They had been part of that exodus. Some of them had gone to European schools, like Francis Marash, although he wasn't alive at this time. A number of them spoke multiple languages. They had been high-level officers in the Ottoman military, various different ranks, and they were continually dressed down and their authority removed from them by the French officials who constrained and circumvented many of their decisions. Another one is that the Syrian pound as a currency was actually a more stable currency than the French franc at that time. The Third Republic of France was not always the most economically powerful government, and recovering from World War I was particularly difficult for the French. But the French compelled the Syrian pound to be pegged to the franc, which caused a number of economic issues, especially for the merchant class within Syria. And that merchant class was further hampered by the fact that there was obstructed trade. The new borders that had been built between Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Palestine, Iraq, Turkey, these things hadn't existed before World War I. And so significant amounts of trade that had naturally occurred could no longer do so, which hurt the economy doubly. Compound this with some another set of famines in the early 1920s, the Jabal al-Duruz situation effectively became a national Syrian situation. And you had nationalists who were arguing against the French authority from day one. So you can see, for example, this is the hanging in Damascus of Arab nationalists by the French in Marja Square, which is one of the main squares in Damascus. And we also see very repressive French methods designed to curtail these kinds of rebellions, such as the bombing of villages and cities in a carpet bombing style of attack. Now, as you can see from the map in the lower right-hand side, the furthest down fire is the Jabal al-Duruz attack led by Sultan al-Atrash. You can see in Damascus that there were other revolts took place there. That was led by Shah Bandar. We're going to talk about him in a bit. You can see in the far east, in the region of Deir az-Zur, that Haji Ayasha Hajj was leading the revolt there. You can see in the north, in Idlib, that you had resistance led by Hananu. And in Hama, you have Fawzi al-Qawqji, who you can see there. And I just want to take a second on Fawzi. Fawzi al-Qawqji was himself a member of the Ottoman military, and after the French occupied, he became part of what was called the Syrian Legion, which was the French trained soldiers who would fight on the side of the French. This was different than the Spécial, in that these troops received direct French training. Despite this, when Qawqji heard that the Great Syrian Revolt was taking place, he abandoned his post, as did many along with him, and fought in the city of Hama, trying to secure it for Syrian nationals. After that point, of course, he couldn't return to being part of the French military, so he lived his life in exile. And in fact, he was one of two major generals leading indigenous Palestinian Arab forces against the Zionist Yishuv during the 1936 to 1939 Palestinian Civil War, and in the early confrontations against the nascent state of Israel. It looks like we are at the witching hour, so we won't be able to talk about the rest of this until next week. But I'd like to ask if there are any questions, comments, concerns. And I will put our links in the chat. So while you're formulating those questions, I just wanted to mention that we are history, mostly ancient discussions, and we have a number of ongoing series. My series, Middle Eastern Islamic History, we convene on Thursdays at 7 p.m. And next week, of course, we're going to finish this story of Syria and Lebanon and start on the story of Egypt and the Sudan. But we also have other groups. We do Greco-Roman civilization. We do languages. We're talking about Ugaritic on the 29th of October at 12 p.m. We also have Jason Pung's philosophy series, which are always Saturday for Asian philosophy and Monday for Greco-Roman philosophy. Aaron and I have our discussions on European Union security. We're probably going to have one in early November. And we have our short run series. We just did a presentation on the Russo-Ukrainian War. And we have a number of other series that are on our YouTube page. So yeah, so if you have a question, comment, or concern, this would be the perfect time.
Richard and Mark, thank you so much. I guess one of the questions I have, obviously, maybe this is far-fetched question, but was there any development of the situation that we have currently right now, or we had in the 70s and 80s in Lebanon, where there's a clear delineation between the so to speak Shia or Muslims and versus the Maronites, and then Christian society, and there was a civil war that was this kind of a foundation that was setting up to be in the beginning, so to speak.
So I was actually going to cover some of that in the 1930s, because the 1930s is when we sort of see the factionalization and the arming of sort of the three distinct camps: the Maronite Catholics, the Sunni Muslims, and the Shiite Muslims. Because those three groups are over 20% of the population each, but none of them is over 30% of the population. So, and they'll sort of jockey around for the smaller groups to stand with them or against them. But Lebanon was in the process of transforming during this period, because remember, Greater Lebanon was a new experiment. Mount Lebanon had always been ruled as a distinct autonomous region within the Ottoman Empire, and the areas that had been affixed to it by the French at the Maronite insistence. It was not the French intention to do this. It was at the Maronite insistence. These were regions that had historically been ruled by the Damascus Governorate. So this was the period when those groups were beginning to understand their relationship in a new governmental structure. And so starting in the 1930s, we begin to see those relationships crystallizing, for example, in the National Pact of 1943, in the crisis of 1958, and as you point out, the Civil War of 1975. Mark, would you like to add something?
Yeah, you pretty much covered. I was going to talk. I'd forgotten to highlight a parallel between the 1860 Civil War and the political chaos in 1958, when Eisenhower sent in U.S. Marines for a while and then came back out without any casualties, to my knowledge, and then 1983, when the American Marines, the French, and the Italians went in to help keep the peace, and that ended much less well.
I was going to say a few more casualties. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you, guys. It was an excellent presentation. Thank you so much for Richard and Mark. And again, so we'll I guess you guys gonna post next Thursday that we're in the continuation of this, subject matter, so to speak.
Mark, are you available next Thursday?
Yeah.
I don't want to assume for you.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Because I'm really looking forward to your World War II coverage.
Yeah.
One of the sort of goes into your question, Zach. If I go back a couple slides, to a slide you haven't seen. Ooh, how crazy is that?
Now you pulled the.
I know. Playing fast and loose with the rules here.
Is it members only?
No, but the real political contest in the 1930s. Well, there were sort of two political contests. The first one is who would be president of Lebanon, and there were two Maronite families that sort of jockeyed between each other over who would be president. But by and large, that political elite does not survive in the independence movement. And so it's worth looking at the Maronites who resisted the French occupation, primarily among them the Gemayel family, and the Arabs who would be the, as they call it, the Syrian Nationalists, the Syrian Social Nationalist Party. And the order's important. They're not National Socialists, they're Social Nationalists. They believe that nationalism would be incorporated of society, not Nazis. But the fundamental distinction between these two groups is that the Maronites under Gemayel and others wanted to maintain Greater Lebanon under Maronite control as an independent entity that would have a distinct relationship, that would be attracted to the West, that would be in connection with this historic Franco-Maronite relationship, and would be something similar in many respects to what we see in Israel today, right? Israel has a special attachment to the United States, not a strong attachment to the Arab states that surround it. Now, of course, there is a functional difference in that the Maronites were a completely indigenous population, right? They didn't migrate into Lebanon. They were already there. The Jews had been expelled and then returned, but that return was a migration. On the Arab side, you had people like Anton Saadeh, and he, in particular, saw that Lebanon should actually return to Syria, right? That the creation by the French of the 6 independent states, this was incorrect, that should not have happened, and that Syria should be returned. Also, the areas that are Israel, the West Bank, Israel, Palestine, Jordan, these areas should also be returned to Syria, that Syria should be a unitary state, including all of these territories. He also includes Iraq in his territory of Syria when he gets most expansive. But at the end of the day, his view is that there shouldn't be a Maronite character to the region, that it should be an Arab character to the region, which is neither prejudicial to Muslims nor to Christians. Remember, he's Greek Orthodox. He's not Muslim. So that's really, but most Muslims are interested in something like that. And so that tends, so despite the fact that he's Greek Orthodox, his voice becomes sort of the Muslim perspective on what should happen to Lebanon, which is that it should be disintegrated and incorporated back into Syria, which would eliminate Maronite control of the region. There's a question about whether I will talk about how the Druze settled in Israel. No, but I mean, I can talk about a little bit about why the Druze are in Israel now. The Druze are concentrated in Jabal al-Duruz, but that is not the only region with Druze settlement. Druze existed throughout the northern region of what is today Israel, the southern parts of what is today Syria, and Lebanon. So while the borders today cut up their historic territory, they didn't historically. It's also worth pointing out that Druze settlements are not necessarily contiguous, because in many cases, Druze were landowners. So they would own a large piece of land that they didn't work, that would be worked by what were called Filah, or Arab settled people. In the case of Lebanon, that came in the form of the Maronites. In the case of Syria, that often came in the form of Sunni Muslims. In the case of what's today northern Israel, that came in the case of Sunni Muslims, and it came in the case of Melkites. Melkites were part of the region. They moved in and out periodically before going back to Lebanon in the early part of the 20th century. So that's why there are Druze in Israel. And Druze in Israel generally exist in two distinct categories. There are those who are in what we can call 1949 Israel, right? Israel after it signs its ceasefires with all the Arab states that had invaded in 1948. And so those territories are relatively concretized. And we can say those territories that Israel acquired through the Six-Day War of 1967. The Druze that are in 1949 Israel generally see themselves as Israeli citizens first, and Arab second. So they don't participate in Arab nationalism. That is very distinct from the Druze in both Lebanon and in Syria, who are absolutely part of the Arab nationalist story. And Arab nationalists have historically included Druze in their definition of Arab. This is also why the Druze in those territories acquired in 1967 in the Golan Heights region often reject the Israeli nationality that the Druze within 1949 Israel have accepted. And they continue to support a Syrian narrative, right? We saw, for example, in Majd al-Shams, which is part of the Golan Heights under Israeli control, that they put a Syrian flag on that statue, which normally does not have a Syrian flag. And that is part of their identity as part of the Syrian story. And in fact, until the Syrian Civil War of 2011, till the present, very few Druze in the Golan Heights region had torn up their Syrian passports and accepted the Israeli permission to naturalize as Israeli citizens after Israel, under its own laws, annexed the region in 1981. So, Eliana, does that answer your question? All right. Any other questions, comments, concerns before we close this out?
No, I just wanted to mention our continued program, for 2 seconds, and then I will close this out. So as I've said, tomorrow, if you guys are in New York, you should stop by, or tickets actually going, because it's pay as you wish. And we're going to actually the New York Historical Society to visit one of the exhibits, which is Silent Witch exhibit, 300-year history of that. And after that, we'll just grab a pizza. It will be 6 o'clock. Then after that, we have on Saturday at 12 p.m. Spartacus. Was it a reality? Was it a myth? How much of it, was a Plutarch's imagination, and Appian imagination, so to speak. Then on Saturday at 7 p.m., we're doing Asian philosophy and Confucianism of Tang Dynasty. Then at 3 p.m., we're going to talk about brief history of shamanism by Garrett P. Jackson. He's basically going to be just covering, what is the shamanism, and and how do the shamans bring through guidance and healing for themselves, other than the communities. So just wanted to mention for this week, and then obviously Richard's going to be doing on Thursday his presentation, and so join us. Thank you, guys.
Yeah. I have a question. I still don't understand why the French went to Syria. It basically comes down to prestige in the international community, and also for the domestic French audience, an expansion of the control of Lebanon, which they felt the cultural ties to, and you have to understand, at that period in time, possession of a colonial empire was a positive thing. It was a thing that elevated the position of the country involved in it. And the French considered themselves to be beholden to the mission the civilizing mission. Yeah, the civilizing mission. And because they were sort of in that mental space, they thought of themselves as in the same way that, for example, many Americans perceive American expansion internationally as being in pursuit of human rights, in domestic economic improvement in the region, and other sorts of positive attributes of growth and development. The French saw themselves this way when entering Syria, and they understood that they would need brutal means to keep the population in control. But they considered that if they removed these elements, if they removed these most aggressive elements, then the people could modernize and develop in a way that would be more civilized and developed. And in many cases, the way that Lebanon was developing, they saw that Syria could do that eventually.
And just to quickly add, one of the experiences out of World War I and also World War II, but France benefited greatly, and I do mean greatly, from indigenous troops from the Maghreb, particularly in the Senegalese. They were, I don't know, maybe in the tens of thousands of troops easily, and they were some of the best troops. The Germans feared those troops, and that was a resource that France could lean upon during that they did in World War I, and then they did again in World War II. So they also saw these colonies and the mandate as a resource of possible troops or labor battalions and things like that.
Absolutely. No, one of the things I try to cover in my series, if you've seen some of the previous episodes on World War I, like episodes 44 and 45, is that I try to point out when the French troops are not just from the hexagon, right? That they're from the other parts of the empire. For example, at the beaches of Gallipoli, you have mixed troops. You have
Senegalese.
You have Senegalese tirailleurs. You've got on the Western Front. I know that there were a lot of Algerians who fought on the Western Front. There is a significant part of the colonial experience that is represented in the troops that are fighting in other areas. Another example we talked about earlier in the series is that when the French invaded Mexico, the dominant soldiers that they had, in addition to the troops from the hexagon, were Zouaves from Algeria, and they actually had an agreement with Said Pasha of Egypt, because Said Pasha was a Francophile, to send Nubians from Kordofan in what's today Sudan to Mexico, because they could withstand the disease-inducing conditions of the jungles in certain areas. And although they couldn't speak French, they were able to communicate with their superior officers through the Zouave, right? Because the Zouave, being native Arabic speakers, were able to talk to these Sudanese, these Nubians, and explain to the French what was going on, and vice versa. You have this situation where France and the UK as well involved the populations of their conquered territories in the conquest of other territories. But it's not just human capital. It's human capital. It's prestige. It's the civilizing mission. It's the connection to Lebanon, that Franco-Lebanese historic relationship, and control of Syria allows them to more effectively control Lebanon. It's you have to also remember that the French tried to control Cilicia, which is in southern Turkey, because of the Armenian relationship to France. Syria was also in some ways a historic land bridge between those two communities that the French valued. So it's not just any one thing or the other. All right, so let's close this out. Thank you everyone for coming, and see you next week.
How to zoom